Hey, what's up, friends? Today, we're going to really enjoy a chess game that honestly feels like we're about to watch a movie. So, I recommend you put this game on your TV, your computer, or wherever you're most comfortable. And above all, do two things. First, really enjoy this game. And second, and most importantly, learn a ton of concepts that we can later apply in our own games. A game between Kramnik with the white pieces and Vishwanathanan with the black pieces. We're talking about two absolute geniuses. I'm not going to tell you who wins until the end, so we can keep up the suspense. The game starts with both knights being developed, and quickly, Kramnik, as was quite common in that era, played the English opening. We're talking about roughly 60 years ago. If I'm not mistaken, sorry, I said 60 years, but yeah, sure, probably. They must have played when they were very young. I meant to say this game is from about 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, okay? Kramnik's game with the English opening, let's say, was quite well known, since he used it a lot. You've told me on this channel that you really enjoy watching games with this opening, so look, that's something we get to enjoy. A very interesting opening. Black continues in a very solid way with e6. I'm going to go through this part quickly because it's interesting, but the most interesting part comes next. And then d5 from Anand, directly fighting for the center. Many of you might think that the most logical move here is to capture the pawn on d5, which could be interesting, but the only thing is that by making this capture, we would leave black with direct control of the center. At this point, we wouldn't have any pawns in the center, but our opponent would. So we should always ask ourselves, whenever we want to make exchanges, for example in the center of the board with our pawns, what the resulting position will look like after that exchange. At this point, we'll realize that, as I was saying, they would be left with a central pawn, and we wouldn't. Absolute control of the center for the black pieces, which, while not disastrous, we could honestly have other, much better alternatives, like, for example, d4. That way, now it would actually be an interesting option to capture on d5, because we would each be left with one pawn. Very interesting. Besides that, capturing here, well, it might be a likely move. Yes, there's no problem with it. It's also very interesting to leave this pawn on c4. Why? Because when there's tension, in this case, tension means that two pawns can capture each other, we need to think about who benefits from this tension. All right, chess teacher, very good. And what does that mean? Since I don't know who benefits from this tension, it's very simple. There will always be one side that can't decide and one side that can. The one who can decide is the one who has the favorable tension. All right? So in this case, who can decide? Black can only either capture or stay put. White can capture, stay put, and also advance. So they can decide whether to advance or capture. In other words, they can decide whether to open the file or keep it closed. Do you get what I mean? Very interesting. So, if the tension favors white, it's better not to capture until you're absolutely sure, because whenever we want, we can capture. Do you understand this? We work on these kinds of concepts a lot at the Academy. And for all of you who are already in, you have a 7-day trial for just €1. You can find it down here in the description. You'll have videos like this one, but a little bit taking it a step further with those more interesting concepts. So here, the black pieces continue with c6, strengthening this semi-Slav structure. This arrowhead shape ending on d5 is usually called the semi-Slav structure. Now, the player with the white pieces, Vladimir Kramnik, develops his bishop as actively as possible since he's pinning the knight on f6 to the queen on d5. h6 is played to chase away the bishop retreats, and now it's black who decides to capture on c4. At this point, it looks like we're losing a pawn, but there's really no problem, because after the pawn advances, in this case to e4, the bishop on c4 will most likely end up recovering that c4 pawn that black just captured, unless they play b5, and that has its pros and cons. Hold on, let me see if I can talk. I just ate an ice cream with almonds, guys, and I've got an almond a little bit stuck right here. All right, look at this, how interesting. The moment black captures, do you remember what I just told you? They give up the center. Well, it's interesting. They win a pawn, yes, but they give up the center. And what Kramnik does at this point is he has two central pawns while his opponent has none. Divis, Granada, Anand. At this moment, pay attention to this because it's extremely interesting. Why does Chesterton say that white has two pawns in the center if black also has centralized pawns? No, when we talk about the center, we're just referring to these four squares here, e4 and d4, e5 and d5, these four. Two pawns for white, none for black. Absolute control of the center for white, an extra pawn for black. You get it, right? So at this point, after this very interesting bishop attack move, which I'm sure you've come across a lot in your own games, the player with the white pieces should retreat the bishop to g3. Now, since white has this central control and black has an extra pawn, black can't afford to lose that pawn. Otherwise, white would have a strategic advantage, and black wouldn't have any. You understand now why it's important to play this b5 move? You should always try to use your strengths, and that comes little by little, okay? You'll learn it over time. Don't worry if I'm going too fast. Remember that you can watch this video as many times as you need. Alright, bishop to e2, a completely natural development for the bishop. Bishop to b7, even though it's blocked for now, this pawn can always advance to c5 and free up the bishop without any problem, right? e5, threatening this knight, and now comes the key moment in the game. You'll see it next, because this knight has two possible, let's say, logical retreats. One is to d5, which Anand himself said after the game that he thought would have been better, and the one he actually played in the game, which is h5. And many of you might say, well, h5 looks really good, because now it's threatening this bishop, and not only is it threatening it, but it's going to end up capturing it. And even though the knight and the bishop are worth the same, having the pair of bishops is usually an advantage. Thank you. A strategic advantage. Alright, so at this moment, why do we say that knight to d5 was better? Besides the fact that it centralizes the knight, it would have prevented the sequence we're about to see, which is going to be extremely interesting. Instead of playing it right away, first Kramnik plays this a4, which is very, very interesting, practically forcing black to play a6, because if they don't, what will happen? If they don't, they're going to lose the b5 pawn. Another way they could defend the b5 pawn is with queen to d7, but that definitely doesn't seem like the best option, because then Kramnik's plan would be carried out with even more force. That's why black plays a 6. And what is Kramnik's plan? You might be wondering, CHESSTEACHER. Well, the plan is extremely interesting. He takes a bit of a calculated risk here, willingly giving up a piece in exchange for a very powerful and aggressive initiative. Let's see if this attack actually works or not as the game goes on, because it's truly magnificent and aesthetically pleasing to watch. Knight takes on g5. Alright, CHESSTEACHER, at first glance, it looks like you're just giving away the knight, right? You can capture it with the pawn or with the queen. However, by moving this knight, we open up the diagonal between the queen and the bishop, right? They're both aiming directly at the knight on h5, which is why we said it was better to place it on d5. At this point, if the knight is captured with the queen or the pawn, you simply play bishop takes h5, and you'd be up a pawn, the pawn you just captured on g5. But of course, if we stop to think about it a little more, we'll clearly see that Anand has the strong option of knight takes bishop while simultaneously threatening the rook. Consequently, we're forced to recapture this knight, and when they eventually recapture our other knight, if you take a close look at the pieces on the side, we'll end up down a full piece. We need to take this into account. It's extremely important. Therefore, at this point, let's put things back as they were. This knight sacrifice doesn't seem to make sense, since black can play knight takes bishop and recover the piece they were down just a moment ago. However, Kramnik's idea was very strong, to sacrifice the knight anyway with knight takes on f7, speculating that now they would have to capture with the king no matter what, since that's the case here. Threatening the queen, king takes knight, and now this knight should be captured with the f-pawn to open the file for the rook. For example, castling would immediately activate the rook, giving check. So Kramnik's idea was to sacrifice his knight for a pawn in exchange for exposing the king. A very, very interesting idea. Let's see if it's good enough to win the game. That's what's great about watching these games. Even though they're played by very strong players and we understand the concepts well, they give us lots of little tricks for our own games. I'm sure that when you're playing online, for example, or playing a tournament game, it's happened to you many times like, oh, now I think I'm doing really well. Oh, now I think I'm doing really badly. Oh, now I think I'm doing really well again, right? And you have to learn to control those emotions and to really understand what's happening in the game. There's a threat of castling with a check coming in, and then afterwards bringing in the bishop and queen, right? That's why Anand wisely moves the king aside. White castles, activating this rook very well, and now knight to d7. At this point, we also realize why it was so important to defend the b5 pawn with the a6 pawn, and not with the queen on d7, because otherwise this knight would have been completely trapped. Now, at least it can be developed properly, right? And the situation we see in this game is that yes, black has an extra piece, that's correct. However, it's true that I find black's position a bit odd, don't you think? Their king here isn't very safe, it's very exposed, this rook is going to have a hard time getting out, a knight that's also struggling to get out, and a bishop that, poor thing, is also a bit badly placed. But remember one thing, if we have an extra piece and we manage to reach an endgame, we'll probably win the game. However, if we're badly placed and white, in this case, manages to launch a lethal attack, it's going to be very hard to defend, right? So the game is completely fascinating. And for those who are curious, I'll tell you right now, at this moment, what do the engines say? Who's better, white or black? What weighs more? The extra piece or the attack, the exposed king, and the poor coordination of the pieces? Well, according to the engines, the position is equal. Impressive, right? All right, let's see how the game continues. The bishop becomes acted. Attacking the e6 square, which is a weak point. Why is it a weak point? Because it's a backward pawn that will never be able to be defended by another pawn again, and right now, no one is defending it, right? They have to defend and address the threat of this bishop taken on e6. How do they do it? With queen to e7? Simple. The game continues with even more activity as the knight moves to e4. The knight is trying to find little gaps, you see? It's trying to find advanced outposts. Those of you who are in the academy and have studied the advanced outposts class, which I uploaded about a month ago or so, the good thing about the academy is that the videos there aren't deleted. You can watch them as many times as you need, and there are new ones every week. So you'll find the advanced outposts class. If you look for it, it's very easy to find. It's very interesting, isn't it? Trying to look for those advanced outposts with the bishop, sorry, with the rook, with the knight, it depends on which outpost is best, right? At this moment, the rook comes in via f6, the knight too, maybe even an outpost on d6. The plan Vladimir Kramnik is coming up with here is really, really interesting. Right now, there's also some speculation about bringing pieces in through f7 if at some point the bishop, the queen, or the rook get activated. At this moment, he says, you know what? He says, I'm going to place the rook on h7 to avoid problems. In some cases, I can bring the king over, or I can bring the rook into the defense, right? To try to fight for this f-file, which for now is controlled by the white rook, right? You already know that rooks on open files are extremely well coordinated, and, well, Kramnik says, okay, then I'll take advantage here and place the knight on the advanced post, right? And as if that weren't enough, I'm also threatening your bishop on b7. It has to be defended with the rook in this case. There's no other way. And here, at this moment, Kramnik makes a mistake. Well, it doesn't mean he's going to lose the game, but let's see what mistake he makes, because it's very interesting. The mistake he makes is this before move, alright? Even so, the game remains extremely interesting, but here the engines suggest, okay? It's very easy to say this once we've already analyzed the game, which is why it's so interesting to bring it to the channel afterwards. They recommend capturing this pawn. After the recapture, no matter which pawn is used, white has a plan that is very, very, very interesting, alright? To bring the rook into f6, not immediately because the knight is on d7, but still, the plan is there. If you capture with this pawn, the rook can come in. If you capture with the other pawn, which actually seems even more logical, there would be an exchange of knight for pawn and rook for pawn, and then the a pawn would fall. So that would have been the right move, or rather the right plan, not going for b5. However, b4 is a mistake, and you'll see why in a moment. Well, just like this knight to h5 move, of course, in a game between humans, it's different. Playing against a computer at the highest level is another story. Among humans, there are always mistakes, and that's totally fine. One of my coaches used to say, you know who's going to win the game? The one who makes the fewest mistakes. Not the one who makes no mistakes, but the one who makes the fewest. So don't worry, no matter who you play against, they're gonna make mistakes. The game continues as follows. A 6 h5 to threaten the bishop on g4, and also to free up the bishop that was completely trapped on f8, for example, via h6, right? So it's a very interesting opening up move by Anand, let's say. Anand plays these moves very precisely. First he plays h5, and you'll see how it continues. After this bishop to h3, well, we have to decide where this bishop goes, and there's nothing better than to keep putting pressure on the weakness, right? Bishop to h6, king to h1, and now bishop to g5. Well, black is getting active. Do you see it? You're getting active. Well, who knows if later they might break through. This bishop on g5 mainly serves to protect against a possible rook entry, as we've mentioned in some variations on f6. That's an important point because it's an advanced post. They already have one occupied, so be careful they don't take the other one. And now the game continues as follows. Queen to c2, rook to g7, and queen to e2. Well, this is a key moment in the game where Anand plays a move that will probably surprise all of us. And it's this one right here. Bishop to a8. What an interesting move, right? The idea is to keep that bishop. Why? Because he's gonna try to free it. Keep in mind, black has an extra piece. This happens in many games. Sometimes you have an extra piece, other times you're down one. Why? Because up to a rating of about 2,200 ELO FIDE, more or less, 2,100, 2022, 99% of games are decided by tactics. You win a piece, you win a bishop, you win an exchange, a couple of pawns, or a serious mistake ends up practically leading to checkmate. Well, that's the idea. At this point, we need to know how to evaluate each situation and when we have an extra piece. Maybe it's not so important to grab a pawn, but rather it's more important that our pieces are active, right? We have 3 pieces against 2, so this bishop, which can be pretty powerful, we're gonna hold on to it for now and look to open it up later. And if we lose a pawn, well, we lose a pawn, but at least we still have that extra piece, right? Right now, the h5 pawn is also being given away, so that adds even more weight to what I just explained, doesn't it? White takes this pawn. After taking on h5, black activates the rook and fights for the f-file, just like I mentioned before, which is extremely interesting. And now, what Vladimir Kramnik does is reposition this knight a bit, since it was not attacking anyone, and he probably considers either attacking the bishop or looking for new routes, like c5, or, of course, the one we have already talked about, f6, which is very, very interesting. Of course, the game continues with c5, which we were expecting. The bishop wants to break free, since it was completely trapped there, right? Knight takes bishop, and now many of you might say, well, it's just a simple exchange. He's gonna recapture with the rook or the queen, right? Well, like I said, this game's like a movie, huh? Viswanathanan doesn't recapture the knight, neither with the rook nor with the queen, but instead chooses to give back that extra piece he had, huh? Do you remember he had an extra piece, right? He gives it back, but in exchange for what? Well, in exchange for doing this, CHESSTEACHER, now you're really messing with me. You're going completely crazy. Just to move a bishop, that's it? That's right. Why? Because now, obviously, when white moves the knight away, because of course, they're not going to let it get captured twice, right? The piece was quickly recovered. Let me go back. The mass of pawns they have on the queen side is starting to look scary. This is what we call converting an advantage. When we already have an advantage, in this case an extra piece, we give it back to get an even bigger advantage. A mass of 3 passed pawns because it's 4 against 1, so 4 minus 1 is 3. These 3 connected passed pawns are ultimately going to serve as the decisive and lethal turning point of the entire game. Either black wins, or white finds a way to defend against them. And then the game could turn around, but right now it's clear that black has succeeded. A mass of pawns that is very, very dangerous. In fact, look, after this pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, now it's even clearer that black has 3 passed pawns. What does passed mean? It means there are no pawns that can ever capture them, ever. The game continues like this: knight to h4, and Anand tells Kramnik that he wants to exchange queens. Why? Because once the queens are off the board, simply put, this mass of pawns can't be stopped by anyone. Because at most, you could sacrifice a rook or a knight, which is really far away, and probably if the queens are exchanged, the game would already be over, right? Look how it continues. Rook takes rook, check, knight. Why? Because this knight here doesn't do much. Maybe it wants to. Whoa, what was that? Oh, well, it's a phone that's not even mine. Let's just leave it over there. Maybe he wants to bring the knight a bit more actively into the defense, and who knows? Yeah, letting the rook through to the other side is going to be very interesting, but Kramnik hasn't said his last word yet. He sneaks in from the back and tells this knight, "Don't move from here, you're pinned, and besides, I want to threaten the pawn mass from behind, which is always much better than threatening it from the front since they defend each other. The last one is always going to be the most defenseless." Rook to f7? Why? Because the threat now was rook to f1. If the white player plays rook to f1, this knight will be almost impossible to defend, and they're going to have serious problems. Therefore, rook to f7 is fighting back, or rather, completely taking control of the f-file is the right move in this case. Knight to f3, threatening the queen has to move, and now this pawn is captured from behind. Is Anand going to lose those pawns, or does he have it under control? Well, look, he pushes this pawn, and it's getting closer and closer to queening. At this point, even though he only has 2 passed pawns, they're much closer to queening, unlike these 3 passed pawns that Kramnik has, right? These 2 pies are infinitely stronger. Why? Because they're much closer to queening. And let's see how the game ends, because it's spectacular. Rook to f1, the queen comes back, attacks the rook, and be careful, because if it attacks the rook and takes it, well, let's be a little serious here, okay? Because sometimes this is bad and sometimes it's good, you know? If the rook gets taken right now, we're gonna have serious problems. Why? Because both the bishop and the black rook are becoming very active, and this king would really suffer, right? It would basically be checkmate. That's why here, of course, white has to defend the rook. There's no debate about it here. Check, the king has to move back to the side, and now it's the other pawn that advances. Anand's pawns are becoming way too dangerous. Either Kramnik finds an immediate solution, or these pawns are going to end up queening. Honestly, at this point, white doesn't have much to do. However, Kramnik finds a spectacular resource. Watch out. I don't know if it's going to be enough for a comeback or not, but it's spectacular. Well, actually, I do know, but I'm not going to tell you. He gives up this bishop in exchange for what? In exchange for activating his 2 pawns as well. Look at the options a chess player has. That's why chess is so beautiful. We'll never ever find 2 identical games, so we can enjoy so many games that we'll never repeat them if we don't want to, right? If we do repeat them, let it be because we enjoy it. For example, this video, I definitely recommend watching it more than once because there are certain details that most likely we won't notice the first time around. However, here Anand finds a spectacular counter resource, and instead of moving this bishop away, he sacrifices the exchange. What does the exchange mean? It means trading a rook for a minor piece, whether it's a knight or a bishop, and not only does he give up the rook, but he also gives up the bishop. If they take the bishop, it's checkmate, so you have to take the rook. If you take the rook with your own rook, a move like c2 would end up winning the game. There would be no way to stop these pawn promotions. Keep in mind that the promotion square is completely defended by the queen, so the rook can never leave the first rank. That's why you have to capture with the pawn. However, Ananona's plan is to keep pressing with this absolutely lethal bishop on h3. The queen tries to support and defend, but after bishop takes rook, that rook had to be given up. I mean, if the rook moves, the queen would come in and deliver checkmate. After bishop takes rook, the queen tries to give some checks. That's Kramnik's last resort to try to force a draw. King to h7, watch out, it's counterattacking. However, after this knight to g6, white had to resign. And let me explain why. These pawns can't advance. If this pawn advances, it's still too far because it needs 3 more squares, and for white, or 2 if this one advances, it will be captured. And not only that, but the deadly threat is this queen coming in on the second rank, and no one can stop checkmate on the next move. You see, there's no way to stop checkmate next. The queen can't get in here because it's simply defended by the bishop. They also can't give many more checks because from here, the white queen doesn't have any more extra checks. That's why, from this point, Black's pieces, in this case, won the game after Vladimir Kramnik resigned. Don't tell me this hasn't been an absolutely amazing game. Hey, if you want to see more videos like this, if you're hooked and want to watch both my videos, which are a bit more professional, and Flavia's videos, she's an amazing master who also makes videos for the Academy, but honestly, her videos cover really interesting patterns that we should apply in our games, a bit more advanced. These kinds of videos, yes. And if you're not sure whether it's worth it or not, don't worry, because you can try it out for free. Well, not exactly free, it's just €1, okay? For €1 or $1 for 7 days, alright? And if you don't like it, hey, you can just leave and nothing happens at all. You paid €1 or $1 to watch all those classes, and that's it. Nothing else happened. Plus, you also get access to ChessMind, which you already know is a paid platform, but you'll get free access there. Well, free as in included with VergeStech. Don't get too excited, okay? You get what I mean, right? 7 days for €1 or $1. If you're interested, you'll find it down below in the description or at chessteacher.chessmind.ai. I hope you really enjoyed this game, and I hope to see you again inside the Academy. A lot of you are joining, and you're loving it. 99% of you anyway. There's always someone who says, look, you know what? Honestly, I just don't really like these videos. They're not for me. I'd rather just stick with the YouTube videos. Hey, that's totally fine. We're not going to hold you back. You can cancel with just one click. Just click once and you're out. It's that simple. We're not going to hold anyone back. Of course not. It's for all of you who are eager to improve with me inside the Academy. I hope you loved it. And now I'm really leaving. Sorry for being so persisting. See you in the next video, friends. Goodbye.